Alex Valdivia is the Director of Research at ThreatConnect, and he's going to be talking to you about getting the most out of threat intelligence. So, Alex.
Thank you very much. All right. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks to SANS for having me. Like Chris said, I'm Alex Valdivia. I'm the Director of Research at ThreatConnect. A little bit about myself. I grew up here in Texas mostly, but I'm based in Mexico City. I've been living there for about 1.5 years now. I've been with the ThreatConnect research team since April of 2015, and before I joined the ThreatConnect research team, I had roles in different kind of security, I guess, operations. One of which was being in IRC chat rooms and monitoring them and making sure we had a persona in there. Really, it was like logging stuff, right? But you sometimes get challenged and you have to interact. So that was an interesting one, piloting that system. Before that, I worked in a SOC-like environment. This was when I was still in engineering school. I had a 3 a.m. shift looking at a bunch of phishing pages and like brand protection incidents and helping to mitigate those. But that's kind of where I got my start in the security world. And a lot of times people have pictures of their kids or pets. I have neither, but in Mexico I discovered that if I stare out my window, which I do often, I'll see a family of Harris hawks hunting together, and they hunt pigeons. So I've snapped some shots of that. It's really cool, actually. Like they do it in teams, so you'll have one like hovering above, sort of watching everything. And then you'll see like just a scattering of pigeons that another hawk sort of scared out of the trees, and then they go at it. So I guess I'll talk about a different kind of hunting in a little bit. But first, I'm going to give some background on ThreatConnect and on the ThreatConnect research team, what we do, how we do it too, using some concepts and frameworks that you might be familiar with. But I want to speak to those to sort of, set a baseline in case I refer to those later. And then I'll walk through a quick example of a small slice, really, of a day in the life of a researcher on our team, and speak to how we kind of relate those concepts to our work, our day-to-day work, and go over some takeaways. And if there's time for questions or discussion, we can do that. So first, a little bit about ThreatConnect. We are an intelligence-driven security operations platform. So you'll see kind of two sides of this graphic, this very nice graphic from our marketing team, which I stole from them. So my team kind of lives here in we're a threat intel research team. So we are, if you hear me talk about threat intel producers and consumers, we are to some extent consumers as well, but we are mostly threat intel producers. And my goal is to help explain how threat intel consumers might use the threat intel that we produce, or if you want to get into producing your own threat intel, I want to speak to that too, because it's not really, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can think of it as kind of intel and operations that are tied together with this feedback loop, where the intelligence that you use to inform your decisions and drive your operations has information coming back to it from those operations. So even for my team, as we analyze malware or network infrastructure, we try to look for things that will help us go back. I think Chris alluded to this earlier, kind of go back and look at your hypothesis and see how that changed. And maybe you should be prioritizing a different type of threat actor or different attack vector. So I want to speak to that a little bit, just because our team, if you go into our platform, you see that we share out indicators of compromise, but we also share out the context behind those indicators. So like the campaigns that they're related to, maybe from historical campaigns or adversaries, malware families. So you can sort of go up in the hierarchy of that group model to look at the strategic side of things. So we want to help, my team wants to help both inform the intelligence side of your operations and the operations side of your operations. And so the way that we do that, I mentioned, we have kind of two functions. We have our intel analysis function. So I have researchers that do just day-to-day, they're in ThreatConnect, they're doing threat hunting, they're doing malware analysis, infrastructure analysis, and they're really producing these intel products, maybe reports of a specific phishing email that we identified, and how that links to maybe some malware and some malicious domains and IPs. and then also, relating that, like I said before, to other sort of higher level campaigns or threat actors. But also, as we do that work, we want to make sure that we're capturing our tradecraft and sharing that with our users as well. And there's different ways to do that. One of them is like what I'm doing right now, coming here and speaking to you folks. Or we can identify processes that are repeatable and well-defined, like we were talking about earlier, and automate those. And the beauty of SOAR is that you should be able to kind of take those automation components. We use playbooks in ThreatConnect and share them out, right? So you can export that and give it to a different team or share that among the communities that you're collaborating with. So we really want to grab those analytic techniques, those workflows, document them, and then turn them into some kind of automated feature, which we have a whole other, we have one person on the team that's dedicated to helping the analysts take their process and write playbooks for them, write apps, use the ThreatConnect API to talk to other APIs to do things automatically. And we also have that function helping us out with data collection systems. So this is, that text didn't really come through, but if anybody watches Rick and Morty, this is, I felt a little bit of this pain when I joined the ThreatConnect research team almost 5 years ago, where a lot of what I was doing was data management and just, copying, pasting IOCs from, my boss would say, hey, did you read this report from this blog? Can you make sure the indicators are in ThreatConnect? Okay, copy, paste, go in there, do some enrichment over and over and over and over again. And so I realized, what's my purpose? This is from, to give the context on this, Rick is kind of like a mad scientist character in this cartoon, and he's sitting having breakfast with his family, and he has a little robot, and he says, pass me the butter, and then the robot brings the butter. And the robot becomes self-aware and says, what is my purpose? And he says, to pass the butter. And that's like a really, it's a pivotal moment for the robot, and it was a pivotal moment for me, like, oh my God, they're paying me to copy and paste indicators into the ThreatConnect platform. I'm supposed to be an analyst. I'm supposed to be, starting a little bit more to the right, I think, where I can look at like a family, like a node graph. I'm a visual person, so like I use our graph view a lot. But yeah, so now what we try to do is build butter robots ourselves, right? We're the Ricks, not the robots. So find the parts of our process that can become little butter robots and build them as playbooks or apps. So we have little enrichment butter robots. So okay, moving to concepts and frameworks. The diamond model of intrusion analysis. This was, let's see, one of the founders of ThreatConnect is a co-author of a paper on this, where they sort of laid out this framework, right? It looks like a diamond, hence the name. You have 4 vertices that sort of lay out 4 essential elements of a cyber attack or an intrusion. So adversary up top, victim at the bottom. Capabilities, which is, you can think of it sometimes like what kind of malware they're using or what kind of technical capabilities the adversary has, and then what infrastructure are they leveraging in conjunction with those capabilities. So I will come back to this. I won't spend too much time on it, but I'll highlight now that it's not just about sort of thinking of those 4 separate things, but about the relationships that occur on those axes, right? And the horizontal axis, this is kind of where you might identify a malware sample and see that it calls out to some C2 infrastructure that's related to more C2 infrastructure. So you're doing these pivots. If you guys hear people talk about pivoting, that's kind of how we think about it in terms of the diamond model. And then the vertical axis is that sort of intent or motivation, behind that cyber attack. So it's a good way to sort of lay out the information that you have and figure out where you want to go with it when you're trying to build we say we try to build a complete diamond when we're looking at a campaign or an attack. The intelligence cycle or intelligence process, I believe this is developed by the US military, but it's pretty straightforward. You have these different phases around a central mission, so planning and direction, collection, processing, et cetera. And you have a continual feedback loop around that whole thing. So my team has regular meetings to go over these things, which is really, that's partly the evaluation, but also the planning and direction. So how are our collection systems doing? Our enrichment systems, our analysis processes that maybe haven't been automated, are the way we send out reports, and what can we do to improve them? This next one is David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain. This one is, I have screenshots of the ThreatConnect platform later in the presentation, but I think this is really sort of where I can highlight the way that our team thinks about the work that we do. So basically, this is meant to illustrate that not all indicators of compromise are equal. So if indicators of compromise is a new term, you can think of it as like malicious domains, malicious IPs, malicious file hashes. So these things down here. And those are, you'll see a lot of feeds that say, we have a malware lab and, we identify hundreds and thousands of these things and we'll, give you a feed so that you can have them and you can block them, which is good, it's useful, but those things are very, very easy for threat actors to switch up, right? They're kind of ephemeral. So what we want to do in order to frustrate the adversary is to move up the pyramid of pain and identify things that are a little harder to switch up, or even if they're not harder to switch up necessarily, we've seen that there must be some kind of cost-benefit analysis from the threat actor side because they just keep reusing things like network infrastructure, or even when you start to observe, if you step back and you take a look at the totality of what that particular campaign is using, you can identify little patterns here and there. Things like, they always use this name or this string in the domains that they're registering, or subdomains. Like, I think for one we saw that they were all like the real names of superhero characters like Tony Stark and other things like that, which is really interesting. Which, by the way, that's really hard to automate, right? So I can't write a playbook that says, if you see a name in the registrant information that is the alter ego of a superhero, then give me an alert. That's a little more complicated. But yeah, so we try to look at these attack patterns and focus on those attack patterns. And if we can, try to develop signatures or queries that we can deploy against sets of data that will alert us when we see new infrastructure or capabilities that match those signatures. So basically what we're doing is saying, somebody just registered a new domain. They're using a lot of the same sort of patterns that we've seen this threat actor do, maybe it was 6 months ago or a year ago. So that doesn't mean that that's the same threat actor doing that, but it gives us more confidence that it's very suspicious and we share that information with our users. So that's kind of the pyramid of pain mentality that we have. And so speaking about attack patterns and really behavior, Mitre Attack is probably something most people are familiar with. I think it's gotten a lot of traction lately, and we do have an implementation of this in ThreatConnect. Basically, Mitre Attack, this is the enterprise version of it. They also have pre-attack and mobile, and they sort of lay different techniques out under different tactics. So the tactics are sort of like the intent of what they're trying to do, and the techniques are how do they do it. This is a clipped diagram, by the way. The matrix looks different, but just trying to fit it in the slide there. So yeah, that gives us a common language to talk about adversary behavior. So I think that's why it's experiencing wider adoption now. Wow, I think my fonts are not playing nice with Microsoft. But really, the important stuff is up here. It's not necessarily a framework or anything like that, but this is, a while back, some members of our team did some research around, metrics for threat intelligence and getting value out of threat intelligence. And these are two I guess, phrases or like a system of looking at metrics that's also comes from the US military. So measures of performance, MOPs, versus measures of effectiveness, MOEs. If you hear me say MOP or MOE, this is what I'm talking about. So basically, measures of performance, which I think are kind of once you've established your processes and your systems, you can take a look at how well they're doing, which is important. But really, you also want to be asking the question, what this says down here is, am I doing the right things? So measures of effectiveness, is that actually having impact in my organization or to my mission? So this chart comes from that presentation as well. Hopefully the good stuff is visible. Yeah, I think this one came through fine. So things, we have two axes in this quad chart. Basically the vertical axis is, easy stuff on the bottom. difficult stuff at the top, and that difficulty is difficulty to measure and track that information. And what we found was that the horizontal axis, some of those are less valuable than others. So just to give you examples, things like number of ingested feeds, that's something we get asked about a lot. How many feeds do you guys have? It's important, right? Like you want to have diverse information coming. If you're collecting threat intelligence or even just indicators of compromise, you want to get as much stuff as you can, maybe. But you want to make sure it's valuable. So there's ways to sort of be picky about that, and I'll come back to that. But really, we want to be more to the right, which unfortunately, sometimes that means we're also higher up. But things like mean time to discovery, mean time to mitigation, countermeasures enacted, can your system help you track those things to make sure that you're getting value from threat intelligence? So I think there's a way to share these slides, so we'll make sure they're available if anybody wants to refer back to this slide. Okay, so now going into the sort of day-to-day operations of the research team. Like I said, we have meetings regularly to sort of go over planning and direction, what threats are we tracking, how are we deploying those signatures for those threats in our different collection sources, and sort of kind of just taking stake of everything we have. But I wanted to focus on the analysis and production and dissemination and integration phases, because I want to sort of give you guys a view of that Intel producer mentality and process. So we can look at a concrete example here. We just have a starting point with a malware sample, and then I'll kind of speak to how we sort of pull on threads there and pivot in that diamond model to unravel that related information and build out a more complete picture of the diamond, and then how we share that out and why we share that out. So in ThreatConnect, if I'm looking at a sample, I have these processes that are part of our day-to-day processes, right? So I want an analyst to go out and look at a malware repository integration that we have, or there's different ways to do that. You could open a new tab. You could go type in the hash or copy and paste the hash in, search and see what's there. And if you see interesting information, you can copy and paste that and put it back and associate it to this in ThreatConnect. You could also download this malware sample if you have it, and send it to an automated malware analysis solution or a sandbox. And then you can go look at the results. You can go to log in to that service, look at their UI, see what's interesting, or if you're comfortable with JSON, you can just pull the JSON and write something to parse that out. So enrichment analysis, that's happening there. But today we do that with a playbook. And this playbook actually does all the things that I just mentioned, using different third-party integrations that we have available to us. So really we're taking some of those predictable and repeatable actions and well-defined actions. And when I say predictable, I don't mean like the result, the values that you get back are predictable. It's just that the sort of steps along the way have already been well-defined. So checking third-party sources, submitting, I kind of spoke to this, but also parsing those sandbox reports can be a pain. And we have the ability to do that automatically, and it just add attack tags and create indicators that are associated. So that's kind of what a playbook looks like in the platform. So I can't read what this one is, but this is probably a malware analysis integration that basically what it does is from the, I can go back here, right? From this malware sample, I can send that sample to a malware analysis solution with a playbook. And then I have another playbook that waits for an alert for that solution, that third-party solution, to say, okay, I've got the analysis results, here they are. And then that playbook, that listener playbook, takes the JSON report, it parses it out, it adds attack tags automatically, because now we can speak the same language as that third-party solution using attack. And it will also automatically create, different network indicators if it found anything, or if there's dropped files, things that are already sort of defined in our data model. There's a place for that to land, so there it is. And that's a much better starting point for one of my analysts than just the file hash and saying like, hey, can you look into this file? Like, what do you know about this file? So now when they log in and they do a search for that file in ThreatConnect, they have all this stuff around, right? So they're starting with a more complete sort of view of the capabilities and infrastructure, the technology access there. So that's kind of the malware to infrastructure step. So we also just kind of look at infrastructure and see what we can identify from the metadata around a domain or an IP address that will help us find other related domains or IP addresses, for example. So in ThreatConnect, I can go in and look at that pay SIM card info domain that came in. I can look at the DNS tab in there and see if somebody had added that, previously. There might have been some new resolutions observed by ThreatConnect. We have our own DNS monitoring in there, but there weren't. It's fairly new at the time. So we look at our passive DNS integration, and we can look at related subdomains or historic IPs. And if I click on historic IPs, I see that there is an IP address there with a first seen resolution that kind of matches the campaign that I'm looking at. So let me go ahead and import it, and then I can repeat that process, right? So now I've pivoted from malware to domain to IP address to the server. So this is like a question when I'm here. I want to know, is this interesting? So I could open up another tab and go look at a third-party source, or I can stay in the platform and answer this pretty important question when we look at IP addresses. How likely is it that it's a dedicated server, or is it just like a domain that's parked and that server has 10,000 other domains on it? So that's an indication that it's most likely operationalized if it's a dedicated server. So we go into PDNS and see that historically that IP address, that server has resolved this other domain or this other subdomain that's there, or host name, that nikiras.tk. So now I've gone from malware to infrastructure to related infrastructure. And so going back to the pyramid of pain, instead of just saying like, we identified that malware and let's share it out and help people play whack-a-mole with file hashes or the IP address or the domain name, and then say our job's done, we want to keep that information together in a single source of truth, platform. Just have that there for historical records, and also add information about the behaviors that we observed. So any registrant info that we saw, domain naming conventions, like I said before, name server reuse, SSL certificate reuse, sort of track those things and put those in the data model as well. We just have a group for attack patterns, for example, and associate anything we see in the future. If we can turn that, like I said before, if we can turn that into a repeatable query against a data set or a signature, a YARA rule, for example, and if you're looking at malware, now you can set it up so in ThreatConnect, you can have an integration, just pull that stuff in automatically, and based on the signature that it matched, if that signature is associated to a campaign or an adversary previously, that data is kind of already there waiting for you when you start your investigation or your analysis. So we have playbooks that do this. We have basically a whole bunch of YARA rules for malware, and we have an integration with a malware repository. So anytime somebody submits a sample that matches one of our YARA rules, it goes into the system. We can automatically enrich it, and we can start a little bit to the right of the process that I mentioned earlier. And so once we're done with our investigation, like I said, this is kind of the operational versus strategic or tactical versus strategic. So we do have what's called in ThreatConnect the ThreatConnect intelligence source, and that is where the output of my team's research goes. And it's not just, we do share those sort of bottom of the pyramid type things like malicious or suspicious hosts, URLs, files, addresses, but we also provide the context. So we try to provide the higher level groups that they're associated to, any previously identified campaigns or threat actors, because when you go in and look at this stuff, you don't want to treat it all equally. I think Chris spoke to this really well earlier, and there are kind of things that you have to do before you try to get value out of threat intelligence. And one of them is knowing yourself or knowing your organization. What are your priorities? What things in these parts of the diamond model, or the top half of the diamond model, can you or might you anticipate if you're at the bottom? For example, do you have a way to slice and dice the threat intelligence data that you're getting to look at specific organizational or industry verticals that have been targeted by certain adversaries? Or are there capabilities that are targeting platforms that you run in your organization? So you kind of have to know a lot about your own organization in order to answer the question, what threats do I care about? So I'd say that's pretty important. And that helps you be picky about the stuff that you pull in, right? So I mentioned the number of feeds question. It might be helpful to have 100 or 200 feeds, but if they're all pulling in the same thing, then you're sort of wasting resources or not utilizing them in the most effective way, right? So if you have a way to, down here at the bottom, that have like a report card or a scorecard for your data sources, that's really helpful. So you can see stuff like, how many unique indicators is this particular open source feed bringing in? Or how often is this the first source to know about those indicators? So if it doesn't do well in the criteria that you've decided is important, then you can just maybe turn that feed off and not have to worry about it, because false positives are a very real problem. So you don't want to pull stuff in if you think that it's, for example, overlapping with another feed by a lot. And then another way to be picky is, once you've got your data sources and you know where you're collecting, are you able to sort of narrow that down? Like here, I have just a clip from our browse screen where you can filter for, I've got a finance tag and target country is United States. And like I said earlier, you can use some of the Mitre Attack stuff. Like they're tracking mitigations really well. They're tracking the platforms, like the targeted platforms, really well. So you can kind of make these pretty sophisticated queries to say, only show me the subset of the data that is associated to sort of that higher level, like the campaigns that I care about, maybe because they were targeting organizations that are similar to mine, or the capabilities that were targeting infrastructure that is similar to mine. And finally, this is another thing that's been covered pretty well today, but I will echo it. Automate smartly, and I think Chris's presentation, if you didn't see it and you're on the webcast, I strongly encourage you to find those slides and the spreadsheet that he mentioned, just because it's really important that you not go in with the expectation that there is a solution that you can just sort of buy and turn on, or put together if you're looking at open source stuff and turn on, and then like security automated, perfect, next challenge. There's definitely, for us in the, like as a threat intel research team, like we want to use our brains. We're going back to like the butter robot thing, right? Like we have a job for a reason, because we need those analytical brains to make some of those decisions and to sometimes step back and look at data across different sources, and we can't automate that all the time. So, have a human review, man in the loop sort of plan ready. And yeah, I mean that's pretty much all I have. Wow, that even clipped the. Don't go to threatconnect.co, please. That should be .com. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.